My sister smiled when the lawyer said she was inheriting the house. Not a grateful smile, not an emotional smile, a victorious smile, the kind of smile someone gives when they've spent their entire life winning. Then she looked directly at me and whispered, "Mom always knew which daughter deserved everything." The room heard it. Nobody corrected her. Nobody defended me. Because for 31 years, my family had believed the same thing. Sarah was the golden child. I was the disappointment. Sarah got praise. I got criticism. Sarah made mistakes and received forgiveness. I worked twice as hard and received excuses about why it wasn't enough. By the time we were adults, it wasn't even questioned anymore. It was simply how our family worked. And when Mom died, everyone assumed the final score had already been decided. The house, the savings, the family heirlooms, everything. Sarah acted like it was already hers. My father acted like the conversation was over. The lawyer even looked uncomfortable when he glanced in my direction. For a moment, I actually believed them. For a moment, I thought maybe my entire life had been exactly what they said it was. Maybe I really was second place. Maybe I always had been. Then the lawyer cleared his throat and said 6 words that changed everything. "There is one final instruction." The room froze. Sarah stopped smiling. Dad looked confused. The lawyer opened a sealed envelope. Inside was a flash drive, and attached to it was a handwritten note from Mom, a note that read, "Play this only after Sarah receives everything." The room went silent, because Sarah had just received everything, and whatever Mom recorded before she died, she never wanted anyone to hear it until that exact moment. By the time the video ended, nobody in the room could look at my sister, and for the first time in my life, nobody could look at me the same way either. My name is Rachel. I'm 31 years old. And for as long as I can remember, my sister was the favorite. Not secretly, not subtly, openly, obviously. Everyone knew it, relatives knew it, neighbors knew it, teachers knew it. Even Sarah knew it, especially Sarah. She was 2 years older than me, pretty, confident, popular, the kind of child adults instantly adored. Meanwhile, I was quiet, reserved, the child who preferred books to attention. Mom used to joke about it. Sarah lights up a room. Rachel hides in the corner. Everyone laughed, including me, at least when I was younger. Because children learn quickly. They learn which roles they're expected to play, and they learn when fighting those roles only makes things worse. Sarah brought home a B. Mom framed the test because she worked so hard. I brought home straight A's. Mom asked why one score wasn't higher. Sarah quit piano after 6 months. Dad said she should follow her passions. I practiced violin for 6 years. Dad complained about the noise. Small things. Hundreds of small things. Each one insignificant by itself. Together they became a message repeated so often that eventually I stopped questioning it. Sarah mattered more. Sarah always mattered more. The worst part wasn't my parents. It was watching Sarah realize she could get away with anything, because she absolutely could. When she crashed Dad's car at 17, he bought her another one. When she failed a semester in college, Mom blamed her professors. When she lost 3 jobs in 2 years, relatives said she was finding herself. Meanwhile, every mistake I made became evidence. Evidence that I wasn't trying hard enough. Evidence that I wasn't responsible enough. Evidence that I wasn't enough. By 25, I had stopped expecting fairness. I built my own life, my own career, my own apartment, my own circle of friends. And honestly, I was happier for it. Distance made things easier. Distance meant fewer comparisons, fewer disappointments, fewer reminders that I would never be Sarah. Then Mom got sick, and everything changed. At first it was minor, a few appointments, some tests, nothing alarming, until the diagnosis arrived. Then suddenly there were treatments, hospitals, specialists, fear, lots of fear. The family immediately rallied around her, including me, especially me. I rearranged work schedules, canceled vacations, spent weekends driving Mom to appointments, not because I was trying to prove something, because she was my mother. And despite everything, I loved her. One afternoon after chemotherapy, Mom sat quietly in my car, watching the rain hit the windshield. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then she unexpectedly asked, Do you think I treated you fairly? The question caught me completely off guard. I laughed nervously. What kind of question is that? Mom didn't laugh. She simply stared out the window, waiting. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know how to answer. Mom sat quietly in the passenger seat. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Neither of us spoke. Do you think I treated you fairly? The question lingered in the air, heavy, uncomfortable, dangerous. Because for the first time in my life, Mom wasn't asking about work, or her treatments, or the weather. She was asking about us, about 31 years of history, 31 years of things nobody discussed. I gripped the steering wheel, then forced a small laugh. I don't think this is the best time for that conversation. Mom didn't smile, didn't laugh, didn't let me escape. Instead, she quietly asked, "Is that a yes?" My stomach tightened, because suddenly I realized something. Mom already knew the answer. She wasn't asking because she didn't know. She was asking because she finally wanted to hear it. I stared through the windshield, watching the rain, buying time, then finally said, "I think you loved us differently." Mom looked away, toward the window, toward the parking lot, anywhere but at me. Several seconds passed. Then she whispered, "That's not what I asked." The honesty hurt, because she was right. It wasn't. I swallowed, then answered, "No." The word barely left my mouth, but it was enough. Mom closed her eyes, and for the first time, I saw pain, real pain, not physical pain, not illness, regret, deep regret. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't explain. She simply nodded, as if she'd been carrying that answer for years, as if hearing it aloud only confirmed what she already suspected. The drive home was mostly silent, but something changed after that day. Something important. Mom started paying closer attention to everything, especially Sarah. At first, nobody noticed. Then it became impossible not to. Sarah had practically moved into Mom's house by then, at least according to her. That's how she described it. "I'm handling everything. I'm doing all the work. Nobody understands how much I'm sacrificing." The family praised her constantly. Every gathering became a celebration of Sarah's devotion. Every conversation somehow returned to Sarah. And Sarah loved it, absolutely loved it. The attention, the admiration, the sympathy. She soaked it up, like sunlight. Meanwhile, I kept helping quietly, driving Mom to appointments, picking up prescriptions, handling paperwork, paying bills when she became overwhelmed. The difference was simple. Sarah talked about helping. I just helped. Unfortunately, people noticed stories more than actions, and Sarah was an expert storyteller. One Sunday, I arrived at Mom's house carrying groceries. The living room was full of relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone chatting. The moment I entered, Sarah announced, "Rachel finally found time to visit." The room laughed. I froze, because I'd been there 3 days earlier, and 2 days before that, and the week before. Mom knew it. I knew it. Sarah knew it. Yet nobody corrected her. Nobody except Mom. For the first time. Mom looked up from her chair, then calmly said, "Rachel was here Thursday." The room became quiet. Very quiet. Sarah blinked, clearly surprised, then forced a smile. "Right, Thursday." But the damage was done. Because for the first time, Mom had challenged the narrative, and Sarah noticed, immediately. After everyone left, Sarah cornered me in the kitchen, her voice low, sharp. "You've been talking to Mom." I frowned. "What?" "Don't play dumb." She crossed her arms. "You've been filling her head with things." The accusation stunned me, because it made no sense. Then I realized something. Sarah wasn't worried about me. She was worried about losing control. For years, she'd controlled the story, the version of events everyone heard, the version everyone believed. And now Mom was starting to see it, starting to question it, starting to pay attention. That terrified Sarah, more than she would ever admit. A month later, Mom's health declined rapidly. The treatment stopped working. The doctors became more honest. The conversations became harder. The future became clearer. One evening, I arrived after work and found Mom sitting alone, holding her phone, thinking. She looked up when I entered, then smiled, a tired smile, but a genuine one. Rachel. I sat beside her. We talked for nearly 2 hours, about childhood, about family, about regrets, about things we'd never discussed before. Then, just before I left, Mom handed me a hug, a long one, longer than usual, and whispered something strange, something I didn't understand at the time. Not everything important belongs in a will. I pulled back, confused. What does that mean? Mom smiled, a small secret smile, the kind she wore when she knew something nobody else knew. Then she simply said, "You'll understand later." A week later, she asked her lawyer to visit. A private meeting, one nobody else attended. Not Dad, not Sarah, not me, just Mom and the lawyer, for nearly 3 hours. When the lawyer left, he carried a sealed envelope and a small flash drive. Neither item was mentioned again, not by Mom, not by the lawyer, not by anyone. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I assumed it involved estate paperwork, legal documents, routine planning. I was wrong, because that flash drive contained something far more powerful than a will. It contained the truth. And months later, after Mom was gone, it would expose everything Sarah spent her life trying to hide. Mom died on a Tuesday morning. At 4:37 a.m., Dad called me. I knew before I answered. Somehow I already knew. The moment I heard his voice, my heart sank. She's gone. 2 words. That's all it took. Everything inside me collapsed. For several minutes, I sat on the edge of my bed, unable to move, unable to think, unable to breathe properly. Because no matter how much you prepare for loss, you never really prepare for it. Not when it happens. Not when it's real. The funeral was held 4 days later. Hundreds attended. Friends, neighbors, relatives, former co-workers, people whose lives Mom had touched over decades. Everyone had a story. Everyone had a memory. Everyone had something kind to say. Except the family seemed focused on something else. Sarah. Everything became about Sarah. How much she'd sacrificed, how much she'd done, how exhausted she was, how devoted she'd been. The praise never stopped, and Sarah never corrected it, not once. At the reception after the funeral, I sat quietly near the back, listening, remembering, grieving. Then I heard my cousin whisper something nearby. I heard Mom left most of it to Sarah. Another cousin nodded. Honestly, that makes sense. My stomach tightened, because the will hadn't even been read yet. Yet somehow everyone already seemed certain. Certain Sarah would inherit everything. Certain I would inherit very little. Certain the story of our family would continue exactly as it always had. Golden child wins, other daughter loses, same ending, different year. A week after the funeral, Sarah practically moved into our parents' house. She handled the paperwork, the finances, the appointments, the estate meetings, or at least she claimed to. Whenever I asked questions, she brushed them aside. I've got it. When I requested updates, she sounded irritated. I already handled it. When I offered help, she laughed. Don't worry about it. The message was clear. This wasn't my place anymore, and Sarah wanted everyone to know it. One afternoon, I stopped by the house. I wanted some family photographs. Nothing valuable, nothing expensive, just memories. Mom's old photo albums, pictures from childhood, pictures from birthdays, pictures from vacations, the kind of things money can't replace. Sarah met me at the door and immediately frowned. What are you doing here? The question stunned me, because it was still my parents' house. I wanted a few photos. She crossed her arms. The estate hasn't been settled. They're family photos. I said no. Just like that. No discussion. No compromise. No kindness. Just no. For several seconds I stared at her, trying to understand what had happened, how grief had transformed into ownership, how loss had become competition. Then I noticed something strange. A stack of boxes sat near the dining room, labeled, organized, prepared, as if someone was already dividing everything, long before the will reading, long before anyone knew Mom's wishes. Sarah noticed me looking, and immediately stepped between me and the boxes. Too quickly. Far too quickly. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. The will reading was scheduled 2 weeks later, and during those 2 weeks, the rumors became impossible to ignore. According to relatives, Sarah was inheriting the house. According to relatives, Mom trusted Sarah most. According to relatives, Mom wanted Sarah to continue her legacy. Every rumor came from the same place. Sarah. Always Sarah. By the time the meeting arrived, half the family seemed convinced the outcome was already decided. The lawyer's office was packed. Dad sat near the front. Several relatives attended. Even cousins who rarely showed up suddenly appeared. Because inheritance attracts people. It always does. Sarah arrived smiling. Not grieving, not nervous. Smiling. Like someone attending an awards ceremony. Like someone expecting a trophy. And maybe she was. The lawyer began reviewing the documents, the savings, the investments, the property, each item carefully explained, each instruction clearly documented. Then came the house, the family home, the biggest asset. The room became silent. Everyone leaned forward, waiting, listening. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, then read the instruction. The residence shall transfer to Sarah Mitchell. A collective murmur spread through the room. Sarah smiled immediately. A huge smile. Victorious. Triumphant. Exactly the smile I'd seen my entire life. Then came the savings accounts. Mostly Sarah. The investment portfolio. Mostly Sarah. Several family heirlooms. Sarah. 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 Again and again. By the end of the reading, it looked exactly like everyone expected. The golden child had won. The disappointment had lost. The familiar ending. The familiar story. Then Sarah leaned toward me, close enough that only I could hear, and whispered, "Mom always knew which daughter deserved everything." The words hit like a slap, because for one terrible moment, I believed her. For one terrible moment, I wondered if maybe she'd been right all along. Then the lawyer cleared his throat. The room paused. He looked down at the file, then back up. There is one final instruction. Sarah's smile faded. Dad frowned. Several relatives exchanged confused looks. The lawyer reached into a separate folder, one nobody had seen before, then removed a sealed envelope. Attached to it was a flash drive. The same flash drive Mom gave him during that private meeting months earlier. Across the envelope, written in Mom's handwriting, were 9 words. Play this only after Sarah receives everything. The room froze. Complete silence. Because Sarah had just received everything, exactly as Mom instructed. And suddenly everyone realized something. The will wasn't finished. Not even close. Whatever was on that flash drive, Mom had planned it carefully, very carefully, and judging by the expression on the lawyer's face, the real story was only beginning. The room was silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Attorney Reynolds stared at the flash drive, then slowly inserted it into his laptop. The screen at the front of the conference room flickered. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then Mom appeared. A few relatives gasped. Dad immediately sat forward. Sarah went completely still, and I stopped breathing. Because there she was, smiling, alive, looking directly into the camera. The room disappeared. For a moment, it felt like she was still here, still with us, still able to speak for herself. Mom smiled gently, then began. "Hello, everyone." Her voice filled the room. Familiar, comforting, painful. Several people immediately started crying, including me. Mom continued, "If you're watching this, then I'm gone." Nobody moved. "And if Attorney Reynolds followed my instructions correctly," a tiny smile, "Sarah has already received everything." Across the room, Sarah shifted uneasily. The confidence she'd been carrying all morning suddenly looked fragile, very fragile. Mom continued, "Good." The room exchanged confused looks. "Good? Why good?" Mom answered immediately, "Because before I tell you the truth, I wanted everyone to reveal who they really are." Silence. Heavy silence. Mom looked directly into the camera, especially my daughters. My stomach tightened, because suddenly I understood. This wasn't about inheritance. Not really. This was about something much bigger. Mom continued. "For most of my life, I convinced myself I treated my daughters equally." Dad lowered his eyes. "I told myself I loved them the same. I told myself I was fair." A long pause. Then, "I was wrong." The room froze. Nobody expected her to say it, least of all Sarah. Mom continued. "I favored Sarah." Silence. Everyone knew it. Relatives knew it. Neighbors knew it. Rachel knew it. Tears filled my eyes instantly, because hearing it spoken aloud felt surreal, like someone finally admitting what had always been obvious. Mom continued. "For years, I rewarded Sarah for things I ignored in Rachel. I excused mistakes. I lowered expectations. And I demanded more from the child who already gave more." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted, because every word was true. Mom looked down briefly, then back up. Her eyes were wet. "Rachel deserved better from me." The room became painfully quiet. Dad wiped his eyes. Several relatives stared at the floor. Sarah looked stunned, as if she'd never expected to hear those words. Then Mom said something that changed everything. "But this video isn't about guilt. It's about truth." Mom reached toward a folder sitting beside her. A folder packed with papers, notes, records, documents, years of them. The lawyer immediately recognized it. I could tell from his face. Mom continued. "The last year of my life taught me something important. People behave differently when they think something valuable is at stake." Several relatives shifted uncomfortably, because they already knew where this was going. Mom opened the folder, then removed a page. "Sarah told people she handled everything." Sarah immediately looked down. "Sometimes she did. Sometimes she didn't." Mom removed another page. "Rachel drove me to 27 medical appointments." The room went silent. I hadn't even known the number. Mom continued. "Rachel filled prescriptions, handled insurance paperwork, sat with me during treatments, called every day." Tears streamed down my face, because I never did those things for recognition. I did them because she was my mother. Mom looked directly into the camera. "And most people never knew." Across the room, several relatives looked shocked, because they didn't know, not one of them. Mom continued. "They didn't know because Rachel never announced it. She simply showed up." Silence. Then Mom turned another page, and everything changed. Over the last year, I noticed something else. Sarah stopped breathing. Literally stopped breathing. Because for the first time, Mom's attention shifted directly toward her. I noticed Sarah enjoyed being seen as the devoted daughter. Nobody moved. More than she enjoyed actually being one. The room froze. Sarah's face turned pale, very pale, because nobody had ever challenged her version of events before. Nobody. But Mom wasn't finished. Not even close. She set the papers aside, then looked directly into the camera. And for the first time, her voice became firm. "Sarah, there are things this family deserves to know." The room went completely silent, because everyone understood. Whatever came next, it was going to change everything. The room was silent. Not the normal kind of silence. The kind that happens when people realize everything they believed might be wrong. Mom stared into the camera. Calm, steady, certain. Then she spoke. "Sarah, there are things this family deserves to know." Across the room, Sarah froze. Dad sat motionless. Nobody looked away from the screen. Mom reached into the folder beside her, then held up several pages. "During my illness, I started keeping notes." The room became still, very still. Not because I expected problems, because I wanted clarity. She looked directly into the camera. When people are sick, information becomes important. Appointments become important. Conversations become important. Truth becomes important. Mom glanced down at the first page, then began reading. February 14th. Sarah told relatives she spent the day with me. Mom paused. Rachel spent 6 hours at the hospital with me that day. Several relatives exchanged looks. Mom continued. March 3rd. Sarah told family members she arranged my treatment schedule. Rachel arranged every appointment. More silence. More uncomfortable silence. Then another page. April 22nd. Sarah told people Rachel was too busy to visit. Mom looked directly into the camera. Rachel visited that same evening. Across the room, Sarah's face turned white, because the pattern was obvious, painfully obvious. Mom continued. I don't believe Sarah intended to become dishonest overnight. I believe she became comfortable being admired. Nobody moved. And eventually, admiration became more important than accuracy. The words landed like a hammer, because everyone knew exactly what Mom meant. Sarah had spent years building a reputation. The devoted daughter, the responsible daughter, the favorite daughter. And she protected that image at all costs, even when it wasn't true. Mom lowered the papers, then looked straight into the camera. Rachel never asked for recognition. In fact, she avoided it. My eyes filled with tears. But refusing credit doesn't mean credit isn't deserved. Dad lowered his head. For the first time all day, he looked ashamed. Then Mom said something nobody expected. Including your father. Dad immediately looked up. Stunned. The room froze. Mom continued. David, you loved your daughters. But you also allowed me to create this imbalance. Dad looked like he'd been punched, because Mom wasn't blaming only herself. She was telling the truth. The whole truth. You celebrated Sarah's successes louder. You excused her mistakes faster. And you expected Rachel to understand. Silence. Dad couldn't speak, couldn't even look at the screen. Because he knew. Deep down, he knew. Then Mom smiled sadly. This isn't about punishment. It's about correction. The room listened carefully, because everyone sensed something important was coming. Something bigger than the house, bigger than the inheritance, bigger than the will. Mom picked up another folder, a blue folder, thicker than the others. Attorney Reynolds immediately sat forward, recognizing it. Mom smiled. The will you heard earlier was designed to create a reaction. The room froze. Sarah's eyes widened. Dad looked confused. Several relatives gasped. Designed? What did that mean? Mom continued. I wanted everyone to see what happened when Sarah believed she had won. Across the room, Sarah stopped breathing because Mom had seen it, seen all of it. The entitlement, the confidence, the certainty. Mom continued, "Now it's time for the real inheritance." The room exploded into whispers. Real inheritance? What real inheritance? Attorney Reynolds slowly opened the blue folder, then removed a document. His eyes widened, even though he'd seen it before. The numbers still shocked him. Mom smiled softly. 10 years ago, my father left me a private investment account. Silence. Nobody had ever heard of it. Not Dad, not Sarah, not me. Nobody. I kept it separate from our family finances. I never discussed it. And nobody knew it existed. Sarah looked terrified because she could feel what was coming. Then Mom revealed the amount. At the time of this recording, the account is worth $2,100,000. The room exploded. Gasps, shock, disbelief. Dad's jaw literally dropped. Several relatives stared in stunned silence, and Sarah looked physically sick, because suddenly the house didn't matter, the savings didn't matter, nothing mattered, not compared to that. Mom looked directly into the camera, then delivered the sentence she'd been preparing for. That account belongs entirely to Rachel. The room froze. Complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Sarah stared at the screen. Frozen. Completely frozen. Then she whispered, "No." Just one word, no. But Mom wasn't finished. Not yet. She smiled through tears and spoke directly to me. "Rachel, this isn't compensation. No amount of money can compensate for years. This is simply my attempt to leave things better than I found them." I couldn't stop crying, because for the first time in my life, I felt seen, completely seen. Then Mom reached for one final envelope, an envelope labeled, "Open Last." Attorney Reynolds stared at it, then slowly picked it up. Because whatever was inside, it was Mom's final gift, and nobody in the room was prepared for it. The room was silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Attorney Reynolds held the final envelope, the one marked, "Open Last." Mom's handwriting covered the front. Simple, careful, familiar. For several seconds, nobody breathed, because everyone understood. This was it. The final thing Mom wanted to say. The final truth. The final gift. The lawyer carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter, several pages long. He unfolded it slowly, then began reading. "To my family." The room became still. "If you've reached this letter, then everything important has already been said." The lawyer continued. "The truth has been spoken. The mistakes have been acknowledged. And hopefully the healing has begun." A few relatives quietly wiped their eyes. Mom continued. "For most of my life, I believed love meant giving people what they wanted. I eventually learned that real love means giving people what they need." The room listened carefully. Sarah needed accountability. Across the room, Sarah lowered her head. Tears streamed down her face. Rachel needed recognition. My eyes filled again. And David needed honesty. Dad covered his face with his hands, unable to hide his emotions anymore. Mom paused. Then came the hardest part. "I failed all three of you." Silence. Heavy silence. Because nobody wanted to hear that. Least of all us. Mom continued. "But failure is only permanent when nobody learns from it." The lawyer turned the page, then smiled softly. Because the tone changed, the sadness remained. But hope appeared. "Sarah," everyone looked toward her. "You are not a bad person." Sarah immediately began crying harder. "But somewhere along the way, you started believing love had to be earned by being better than someone else." Nobody moved. It doesn't. Love is not a competition. Family is not a competition. And your sister was never your opponent. Sarah buried her face in her hands, because for the first time in her life, someone had finally said it, out loud. Mom continued. Rachel. My heart stopped. There were years when you felt invisible. Tears rolled down my cheeks. I know that now. And I am sorry. The room disappeared. Everything disappeared. Because those words mattered more than the money, more than the inheritance, more than the house, more than everything. Mom continued. You spent your entire life proving your worth to people who should have recognized it without proof. I couldn't stop crying. So stop proving it. Silence. You are enough. The words hit harder than anything else, because they were the words I'd waited my entire life to hear. Then came the final section, the section addressed to Dad. David. Dad slowly looked up, eyes red, face wet with tears. Take care of our daughters. Both of them. Not the version you've always seen. The version you've been missing. The room went silent. Dad nodded. Slowly. Painfully. As if he finally understood. Then the lawyer reached the final paragraph. Mom's last words. The last words she would ever speak to us. My greatest hope is that this family stops keeping score. Because scorekeeping creates winners and losers. And families should never have either. The lawyer's voice softened. Choose forgiveness if you can. Choose honesty even when it's uncomfortable. And choose each other while you still have time. Then the final line. A line written separately from everything else, underlined twice. The real inheritance was never money. It was the chance to do better. The lawyer lowered the letter, and the room fell silent. Nobody moved for nearly a minute. Then something unexpected happened. Sarah stood, slowly, shaking, trembling. She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. Then she walked across the room. Every eye followed her. Every person watched. Sarah stopped in front of me, tears running down her face, and quietly said, I'm sorry. I didn't answer immediately, because there were too many years, too many memories, too much hurt. Then she continued, I spent my whole life needing to win. More tears. And I never realized what it was costing you. The room remained silent, because nobody knew what would happen next, not even me. Finally, I stood and hugged her. Not because everything was fixed, not because the past disappeared, because healing has to start somewhere. And maybe this was the beginning. Dad joined us moments later, then all three of us stood there, crying, holding each other, for the first time in years, not as competitors, not as favorites, not as disappointments, just family. 6 months later, I used part of the inheritance to establish a scholarship in Mom's name. For students who felt overlooked, students who worked hard without recognition, students who needed someone to believe in them. The first scholarship plaque hangs in my office today, and beneath Mom's name is a quote from her final letter, the quote I read whenever I need to remember what really matters. The real inheritance was never money. It was the chance to do better.